but to the heaviest jazz, whatever, avant-garde, anything. You can usually pick out, you can learn something, even if it's don't do that.
In Led Zeppelin, the band often credited with redefining the entire framework of modern rock, the spotlight has long belonged to Robert Plant with his divine voice, Jimmy Page as a guitar sorcerer, and John Bonham as the unstoppable force of fury behind the drums. But what about the fourth man? The one who didn't scream, didn't smash drums, didn't set stages ablaze, but instead stood in the shadows, quietly weaving hypnotic layers of sound like an alchemist at work. John Paul Jones, bassist, keyboardist, composer, architect of harmony, and the quietest soul among the four pillars of Led Zeppelin. No scandals, no headlines, no demands for recognition, and yet it was he who turned No Quarter into rock's most mournful hymn, who unlocked the Eastern mystique behind Kashmir, and who served as the final anchor keeping the band from splintering into chaos. In a world where ego often overwhelms the music, he chose the opposite, to disappear so the sound could speak. His life story isn't one of fighting for the spotlight, but of the quiet, relentless struggle to preserve artistic identity amidst the temptations and collapses of an era. How does one man survive the 1970s, with its drugs, scandals, and even death, and still emerge with his family, his clarity, and an unwavering loyalty to his art? Join Rock Discovery as we trace this subtle but spellbinding journey, where John Paul Jones never had to step into the light to become immortal. Early life. John Richard Baldwin, who would later adopt the stage name John Paul Jones, was born on January 3, 1946, in the tranquil town of Sidcup, Kent, England. He was the second child in an artistic family. His father, Joe Baldwin, was a saxophonist and band leader for post-war touring acts. His mother, Mary Baldwin, was a strict, meticulous church organist who placed her faith in classical music as the only viable escape from poverty. The Baldwins weren't wealthy, but music was everywhere. From the cradle, John was surrounded by trumpet solos, brass sections, church hymns, and the swing tunes his father would blast on the kitchen radio every morning. Joe was often away, touring for months across the UK and Europe. When he returned, he brought stories, thrilling tales of packed theaters, eccentric musicians, and electric nights on stage, but also carried an air of detachment, like a man who no longer belonged at home. It was Mary, not Joe, who laid the musical foundation for their son. She wasn't one for displays of affection, but she was there every day, demanding practice, correcting phrasing, adjusting rhythm, and having John rewrite harmonies until they reflected the correct spirit. For her, music wasn't entertainment. It was ethics. It was labor. It was the only force strong enough to keep a sensitive child from slipping into meaninglessness. Jones learned to read sheet music before he could read full sentences. By 14, he was already playing organ for the local church, not out of praise or recognition, but because it was his duty. There were no standing ovations, no rewards, just sound and repetition day after day. But what no one saw behind his composed exterior was that John was a deeply sensitive, inward-facing child who taught himself to play mandolin, bass, and guitar, simply to avoid having to talk to strangers. While other kids played football or hung out in the street, he sat alone in his room, experimenting with every scale, from Bach to the blues. Music wasn't a skill, it was a refuge. Years later, at the height of global fame, he would say in a rare interview, "I don't like talking to strangers, but I can play music for them all night without feeling uncomfortable." That is John Paul Jones, a solitary soul raised in the strict discipline of music and the absence of overt affection. And perhaps because of that, he developed an extraordinary understanding of harmony. He didn't just play music. He understood its architecture like a sonic architect, well before any of his peers. And from that quiet isolation, a rare ability was forged. The ability to hear what others ignored, to turn silence into voice, and to transform a child too shy to speak. into the silent genius of rock and roll. Early career. Unlike many rockers who got their start playing in rowdy pubs or chasing stardom with teenage garage bands, John Paul Jones entered the music world through the front door, but by way of the backstage. In 1962, at just 16, he joined the touring band of Jet Harris and Tony Meehan, two veteran members of the Shadows. It was during that time Jones learned the most important lesson of his life. Music is serious work. No glamour, no showboating, no compromise. After a few years on the road with touring acts, he quickly caught the attention of London's top music producers. By the mid-1960s, Jones had become one of the most in-demand session musicians in the UK, with a schedule so packed that he once recorded 4 arrangements for 4 different artists in a single day. From Dusty Springfield and Herman's Hermits to Shirley Bassey and Tom Jones. What many don't realize is that some of the biggest hits of the era, It's Not Unusual by Tom Jones, Sunshine Superman by Donovan, and even arrangements for the Rolling Stones, all bore the subtle but unmistakable imprint of John Paul Jones. His name rarely appeared on the credits, but he was the one setting the pulse for the stage, even if he never stood on it. In the world of studio recording, where every note is measured, documented, and polished to precision, Jones wasn't just a player. He was a translator of artistic vision. He could read what an artist wanted, sense what was missing, and fill in the gaps with elegance. With the ear of a classical composer and the instincts of a jazz musician, he became the secret weapon of London's recording scene, irreplaceable and quietly indispensable. It was during one of those sessions that he met Jimmy Page, then also a highly respected session guitarist. They didn't speak much, but Page immediately sensed something rare in the quiet, brown-haired man across the room. Absolute precision paired with limitless imagination. So in 1968, when Page set out to form a new band, something heavier, freer, something that broke away from the conventions of pop rock, he called only 3 people: a wild voice named Robert Plant, a thunderstorm in human form named John Bonham, and John Paul Jones, who picked up the phone when his wife Maureen said, "Someone named Page just called. He says he needs a bassist." Just one phone call, no contract, no negotiations. And Led Zeppelin was born, with a bassist unlike any other, quiet, masterful, and someone who had never once lost the beat. Career breakthrough. From the very first album, Led Zeppelin, 1969, the world was instantly captivated by Jimmy Page's searing guitar, John Bonham's unrelenting drumming, and Robert Plant's otherworldly vocals. But at the center of that sonic whirlwind was something few people noticed: the near-perfect cohesion between bass and keyboards, the very foundation of the band's complex yet seamless musical architecture. And the man behind it all was John Paul Jones. Without ever fighting for the spotlight, Jones entered Led Zeppelin like a sound engineer, quietly erecting pillars, connecting layers, and sculpting depth into songs that often teetered on the edge of chaos. While Plant and Page chased explosive jams driven by raw emotion, Jones was the one drawing the map, maintaining balance, and preventing everything from collapsing. He was the lone voice of clarity in a band ruled by instinct and intensity. It was Jones who crafted the haunting keyboard line in No Quarter, a spectral, dirge-like epic that turned rock stages into sites of metaphysical ritual. He arranged the orchestral strings on Kashmir, a hypnotic, Middle Eastern-inflected masterpiece with a structure so intricate no other rock band of the time dared to attempt it. With Trampled Underfoot, he steered Zeppelin into funk territory without losing their British soul, laying down a thick, gliding bass line that pulsed like a subway train in the night. But Jones didn't just play bass, he played everything. Mandolin on Going to California, mellotron on The Rain Song, blues piano on Rock and Roll, and even a pipe organ inside Headley Grange Church for the recording of Stairway to Heaven. Every time he switched instruments, Zeppelin took on a new color. No one else in the band had that kind of range. And while his bandmates spiraled into parties, drugs, and scandals, Jones retreated to his hotel room, reading books, writing music, and calling his wife and daughters. He avoided hard drugs entirely, drank little, and never trashed a hotel room. In the wildest rock band of the 1970s, he was an anomaly. For over a decade, Led Zeppelin didn't just sell millions of records or shake stadiums, they redefined the very structure of rock, turning it into an epic journey filled with non-linear harmonies and cinematic soundscapes. And at the heart of that revolution, John Paul Jones was the one writing the score. No spotlight, no solo mic, but the whole edifice would have collapsed without him. In 1980, after the sudden death of John Bonham, the band disbanded. Jones was the first to support ending Led Zeppelin's name. Not because he wanted it over, but because he understood that forcing it to go on would only create a hollow echo of what once was. Every legend must fade. But some leave behind the architecture that held the legend together, and John Paul Jones was exactly that man. Controversy, the hidden wounds. Within Led Zeppelin, John Paul Jones never raised his voice. He didn't argue in the studio. He never sought press time, never signed drum heads, never smashed guitars on stage. But over time, that quiet presence, once a pillar of strength, became the saddest blur in the portrait of a genius. In 1994, when Jimmy Page and Robert Plant reunited under the name Page and Plant, released the No Quarter album, and launched a world tour, John Paul Jones was never invited. No phone call, no message, no courtesy check-in. He learned about it the same way the rest of the world did, through the press. And when a journalist finally asked, Jones replied with a bitter smile, "I found out they were reuniting because I read it in the newspaper." It wasn't just a comment. It was a wound. From two musical brothers who had stood beside him for over a decade. Perhaps in their eyes, Jones had always been too quiet to remember. And in the eyes of the public, he had faded into the background, even though he had composed, arranged, and built the very foundation of Zeppelin's legacy. Not long before that, at Live Aid 1985, the band had attempted a rushed reunion, with Phil Collins subbing in for the late John Bonham. It was a disaster, off-time, under-rehearsed, disjointed. Critics slammed Page for sloppy riffs, Collins fired back, and Plant distanced himself. Jones said nothing, as always. But for him, that moment marked a shift. He realized that legends cannot be patched together in haste. Some critics once dubbed him the mathematician of music, implying that his work was too calculated, too perfect, lacking the raw, reckless spirit of rock and roll. But they missed the point. It was precisely that cold, steady head that kept Led Zeppelin from imploding under the weight of ego, drugs, relentless touring, and looming death. At a certain point, Jones began quietly stepping away from official documentaries, formal interviews, and retrospectives about Led Zeppelin, not out of bitterness, but as a quiet form of self-preservation. If the world only cared about the fire and not the one who tended it, perhaps it was better to step back. He didn't lash out, didn't accuse, didn't play the victim. But the sadness was visible, in the eyes of a man who once wove an empire, only to be left out when others came to rebuild the ruins. John Paul Jones was never the center of Led Zeppelin, but because he never demanded to stand in the center, being pushed to the margins hurt in a way no argument ever could. In rock history, some are forgotten because they were forgettable, and some are forgotten because they did their job behind the light too well. Personal life. While Led Zeppelin was once dubbed the most testosterone-fueled band in the world, with tales of all-night parties, hotel room rampages, obsessive fans, and fleeting backstage affairs, John Paul Jones was quietly writing letters home to his wife. He married Maureen Baldwin in 1967, a year before Led Zeppelin was even formed. At the time, Jones wasn't a legend, just a tireless studio musician with 14-hour workdays. But their love, like Jones himself, didn't come from bright lights or sweet talk. It came from stability, conversation, and an unshakable trust between two people who respected each other's space and vocation. Throughout Zeppelin's explosive years, as Page sank deeper into substances and Plant grieved the loss of his son while on tour, Jones remained the constant. Dressed in a suit, showing up on time, and the only member of the band who never left his wife. No scandals, no tabloid shots with groupies, no exposés, no kiss-and-tell memoirs. To gossip-hungry journalists, John Paul Jones was practically invisible. He and Maureen had 3 daughters. When they were young, he arranged tour schedules to avoid being away too long. At times, he turned down major production offers from the U.S. just to walk his kids to school, tend the garden, or play mandolin on the porch. In a rare interview, when asked how he managed to keep a marriage intact in a world full of temptation, he simply replied, "I'm not much of a party guy. I like coming home." His private life has been so quiet that almost no one writes about it. But in an age when rock stars died from excess, marriages collapsed under fame, and families shattered from endless touring, that silence may be the most extraordinary part of all. No courtroom dramas, no secret children, no skeletons for the tabloids to dig up. Just a man who chose steadiness as the foundation for both his career and his love. While the rock world staggered under ego and destruction, John Paul Jones, the quietest one, ended up keeping the most: his music, his family, and himself. Legacy and influence. When people talk about the greatest bassists in rock history, the conversation usually centers around iconic riffs. Think Paul McCartney, Geddy Lee, or Flea. But with John Paul Jones, the legacy isn't in isolated notes. It's in how he built entire sonic worlds, solid as architecture, fluid as cinema, and driven by an endless spirit of experimentation. Within Led Zeppelin, Jones was the only member with formal classical training. He studied harmony, orchestration, and composition from a young age. If Page was fire and Plant was wind, Jones was the architect, the silent conductor who made sure all the chaos didn't collapse into ruins. His versatility alone commands respect across the entire music industry. Not just a world-class bassist, he played piano, organ, mellotron, mandolin, harpsichord, recorder, and even the bulky early-era Moog synthesizer. In a band known for raw instinct and unfiltered energy, Jones was the one element strong enough to give emotion structure, a true architect of harmony. Dozens of musicians from later generations have acknowledged his influence. From Justin Chancellor, Tool, John Myung, Dream Theater, and Chris Squire, yes, to Steven Wilson, Porcupine Tree. Not just for his technique, but for how he approached music as a three-dimensional space, where every instrument had depth, intention, and role. After Led Zeppelin disbanded, Jones didn't bask in nostalgia. He kept working tirelessly as a composer, producer, and collaborator. From delicate film scores to projects with Brian Eno, R.E.M., Lenny Kravitz, and Peter Gabriel, he always appeared precisely when needed, did the work, and quietly slipped away. Notably, in 2009, he formed Them Crooked Vultures with Dave Grohl, Foo Fighters, and Josh Homme, Queens of the Stone Age, a heavy rock supergroup with the layered depth and arrangement flair reminiscent of Zeppelin. At 63, Jones played as if time had never touched his fingers. Even now, in symphony halls, in music theory classrooms, and in the subtle layering of bass lines in modern rock, the shadow of John Paul Jones remains. Never loud, never showy, but unmistakably irreplaceable. Some artists leave behind melodies, others hit singles. John Paul Jones left behind a way to organize sound, to shape it, structure it, and reach into the deepest corners of the listener's mind. Present life. At 79, while many of his contemporaries continue reliving their glory days on reunion tours, John Paul Jones has chosen a path few dare to take, retreating into the background, creating on his own terms, and living music as an extension of inner life. No spotlight, no memoir, no exhibition. In March 2024, he made a quiet return to the stage at the Big Ears Festival in Knoxville, the largest experimental music event in the U.S. But there were no renditions of Whole Lotta Love or Black Dog. Instead, he performed abstract versions of No Quarter, Going to California, and When the Levee Breaks, using pipe organ, mandolin, piano, and lap steel. The hall fell completely silent, as if everyone was holding their breath while an artist narrated his memories through sound, not words. That same year, he appeared in an unannounced performance in a tiny London venue with Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth, improvising between electric bass and classical piano for a crowd of fewer than 100. No footage, no promotion, and perhaps that's what made it eternal. Beyond performing, Jones continues to push boundaries with his experimental project Sons of Chipotle, alongside Finnish cellist Anssi Kartunen. Together, they blend contemporary composition, free improvisation, and classical textures into something that defies genre, where he is no longer the former member of Led Zeppelin, but simply John, a musician exploring uncharted silence in the corners of his mind. Most notably, he is currently composing a new vocal cycle based on poetry, written specifically for mezzo-soprano Dame Sarah Connolly and the Piero Ensemble. The piece is set to premiere in October 2025 in London, marking his full transition into the world of high art. No electric guitars, just suspended verses floating above cello and clarinet. A 21st century Led Zeppelin, without a crowd and without distortion. Though he occasionally grants selective interviews, such as his appearance on Steinway and Son's podcast Soundboard, John Paul Jones is virtually invisible online. No personal YouTube channel, no tours, no charts, no meet and greets. Yet his listeners, those who still sit quietly with No Quarter echoing through their nights, know this: he never stopped. He simply walked a different path, quietly, without a guide. "I don't need people to remember my name," he once said. "As long as they still listen to the music, that's enough." In a world where everyone shouts to be seen, John Paul Jones chooses the smallest sound and the truest. And perhaps that's exactly why he never fades. John Paul Jones never demanded recognition. He never tried to explain who he was. In an era where fame is forged through noise, he chose to step back. And from that quiet space, he built an entire legacy through his very absence. No one claps for the arrangement. No one shouts the name of the bassist. But when you hear Kashmir with its layered orchestration, when the haunting chords of No Quarter echo through the night, when the mandolin in Going to California evokes something distant yet deeply familiar, you know someone is whispering in your ear. He doesn't appear, but he reaches you all the same. In Led Zeppelin, he was the anchor. In life, he was a faithful husband, a quiet father, an artist with no spotlight. And in music, he was a structure, solid, intricate, invisible to the eye, yet present in every tremor of the sound. Glory, perhaps, was never what he sought. What mattered was to exist truthfully, not as a legend, but as the one who shaped the sound that made legends possible. If you believe the world still needs artists like John Paul Jones, those who don't need to shout to be heard, share this story. And if you've ever been stilled by the opening of No Quarter or felt a chill during that dreamy bass line in Ramble On, leave a comment below. What was the first song that made you remember John Paul Jones? And in your eyes, what moment made him irreplaceable in Led Zeppelin? Tell us below, because your memory too is part of the legacy he left behind. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep discovering true journeys of the quiet souls who ended up being essential to music history.